Good morning, gentle readers. It's April 6, 2025. Today in Logos 2000, what I imagine is that we might follow on after the last episode was titled End Run Around, or End Run Around, or End Run Around, with the idea of sort of that the conclusions of logicist positivism finds itself reinvigorating Platonism, and that Platonism finds itself requiring logicist positivism, that for both there's a strong mathematical Platonism and strong logicist positivism. Then as with regards to what there is seen to arrive at from the infinitary reasoning and the superclassical, that the ideas of what then makes for that a sort of surprising and to some extent result in the laws of large numbers, plural, is something that needs to be kind of made as part of the practical surface of mathematics, because it arrives at that it's thoroughly connected with all the developments in mathematics. And as what advised then the notions of superclassical, like the geometric series, or Zeno's arguments, generally as it's called, about the doubling spaces, when those get involved with matters of individuation of a continuum, or when things are between and among the continuous and discrete, that are two quite entirely different things, that yet attain to each other and reach toward each other, yet only via these analytical bridges can be seen to be not ultimately untrue, as with regards to how they're so real in this mathematical universe. Then there's later into things like after the geometric series and the idea of motion at all, and continuous quantity like time, and all the related rates problems in the world being related thusly by at least one common parameter mathematically, and that then there's in the later analysis, there's the Fourier style analysis and the windowing and boxing that then gets involved for this higher order analysis, and then into the spectral and these kinds of things, that the development is for infinitary reasoning, and what possibilities that has, and then how to prevent that from just running and galloping right away with itself, and becoming more of a runaround than an end runaround. The dialectical, the discursive, the knockabout, as from reading Derrida and Husserl about their considerations that kind of come together to prevent themselves from tearing each other apart. So the Derrida and Husserl reflect great adherence in the logicist positivism course that is yet can't ignore the Platonistic course. And so when it comes to nominalism, it kind of can be pointed back to Ockham and the medieval philosophers. So after Aquinas, and then Aquinas being very much an Aristotelian, say, and then Duns Scotus, and Duns Scotus having the supernatural, and the infinity is in, and otherwise making for accounts why it is so, that it's the fuller and wider Aristotelian as well, with an actual infinity, and then for like the various kinds of continuous domains that have been part of the discourse since thousands of years ago, not just since the latest 1875 Eureka moment, which is, I mean, these things are always being turned over by thinkers over time, since forever in antiquity. Then there's Ockham, and so then Ockham was not so much in the sense of the technical philosophy having much to say, except less. And so when it's pointed at Ockham, then there's the whole idea of nominalism. So nominalism sort of arrives as Ockhamism, and so a lot of the things that come down as after Schopenhauer or Comte, and then Bull and Russell and Whitehead, and these says that for Carnap in the 20th century can be basically derived from William of Ockham, 1300s or 13th century, 1200s. Franciscan friar, if I'm not mistaken, from England, who has, besides various notions of, after was being discussed, like the rights and the will of things. This is from reading Copleston's history on the medieval philosophers, that section. I acquired book 3, parts 1 and 2, that. And so reading about that helps to explain and establish that Ockham didn't have much to say about the technical philosophy and adding anything, yet as well has that this notion of nominalism can be related to Ockham, and then as well, then that points back to a branch of Aristotelianism. And as with regards to the prior and posterior analytics, that is the prior analytics is what that's about. So then that just helping to connect more of the thread, that reading more of the medieval philosophers then gets all back into Suarez as kind of like the Catholic Church's Platonist position that made for the technical, that is completely rational, and then there's kind of this triumvirate of Suarez and Mersenne and Arnauld, and then between them sits Descartes. But then Descartes really lifted up above that and made for so that a lot of the ideas that Descartes had, like the vorticial theory or being able to show some theories of optics and these kinds of things, contributed to more than just merely a philosophical understanding or apparent wisdom, apparent knowledge of the Platonistic ideals is technical and not merely ideal but also concrete. Then after Descartes was kind of what gets into then the Renaissance, where the whole idea of the Renaissance was kind of like the rebirth of the things, is again idealism again, and then all this flourishing of all kinds of methods in mathematics and the Bernoullis and a bunch of different kinds of things after Napier and the logarithms, and that it began to produce new schools and fields of higher level objects in mathematics, as of after geometry, algebra, and arithmetic. If you've followed, or you can find in others of these podcasts here, much to do about the deconstructive accounts of geometry, arithmetic, algebra, number theory, and then for function theory and topology, and then for operator theory, to help make it so that all these continua and individua in the mathematical universe have their the repleteness, and then in their deconstructive accounts, they can be put together various ways, and then it helps to show that this theory of potentials, the potentialistic theory, is much more so about this these universals and ideals that are classical and linear in the middle, which is kind of like the crux and focus of all our perspectives that we can talk about as the classical and linear in the middle, arrives at from all these terms in the wider outside. And then what has happened is axiomatics just starts with that instead of kind of having that given as from this wider surrounds, giving it as its own stipulation, that then according to reason and rationality, then that is a false bottom, and it falls out. And so then there's not really this recourse except for this whole wider dialectic and the potentialistic to be thoroughly for the principle of sufficient and thorough reason, having that the surrounds implements the center of the thing. And so then the origin is everywhere. One of these other, and the notions of Descartes' original analysis has that then here that's considered as with regards to the axiomless natural deduction, making an axiomless natural geometry from a spiral space filling curve, which is a continuum to begin, and that gives for free then all the classical constructions and makes for a Euclid's geometry without the axiomatics so much as that there's a theory at all. So it's yet is in a sense axiomatic theory that it results in model theory that's making the same of a theory that models the same axiomatic theory, though with not so much its inductive guarantees, except as after these deductive guarantees. So that helps to show that there's a deconstructive account of geometry. And then for arithmetic, the operations themselves, and relating these to numbers and counting variously, the ordinal and the cardinal, that they're two different things. And then for relating that there's a way to look at if someone's only got a chopper and they can only divide, and someone's only got a compressor and it can only increment, instead of making it the ones and the others are just the inverse of one of those, that both of those exist. And then in the middle, they arrive at what would have been like infinitely much so the one way and infinitely much so the other way, have y, then this 0, 1, and infinity, then get into things like, well, from our geometry and this spiral space filling curve, which also looks like a circle, and the unit hyperbole, has that these regular single points, 0, 1, and infinity, these identity expression constants, 0, 1, and infinity, with 0 times this infinity equals 1 in the middle. It's in the middle. 1 is in the middle of 0 and infinity. That these sorts of deconstructive accounts are necessary to arrive then at some of these ways to get to these sorts of higher orders of infinitary analysis. Another thing that happens in trying to figure out some of these things is then for a consideration of an entire space of them. And so it's one thing to have this classical in the middle, and then the field, we usually think the field is from tiling the field. And so to make it into sections and then have the square and the area and that kind of stuff. So the idea then is that in making all the spaces of zeros and ones, given a beginning and no end, is that there's a couple different ways to look at that. And only having one way, as according to how it's kind of so arrived at, makes it possible to come up with ways to show that it's not internally consistent. See, to have it like so. And that, of course, is the ultimate bane of any kind of inductive account, is to not be internally consistent, because it's entirely derived from the principle of contradiction. And so the principle of contradiction is also called the principle of the excluded middle, or the law of the excluded middle. The third does not exist. Tertium non datur. It's two alternative conclusions disagree, vis-a-vis that two alternative conclusions open up a wider course. So the idea of the principle of contradiction being the grounding of the principle of sufficient reason is something else that Copleston describes as regards to after Ockham and the Ockhamites, as with regards to, I'd better know their names, of John and Nicholas, of these places, and it's the places I'm forgetting, because it's like of in the time of Ockham, then the arguments were brought up that the principle of contradiction was then, and it's for the prior analytics of Aristotle, that there's, still yet besides that, that the principle of contradiction was the whole law of excluded middle. And so you can say that's classical, and you can say that it's so in the finitary and in closed categories. It's so, it's not unso. Here, though, instead, we have, because you got to have something, though, that's going to be able to arrive at that. And so the principle of inversion has that you got to look at it both ways. And then weighing on the relative merits with regards to all the other matters of relevancy, relation and relevancy, whether or not the principle of contradiction can be seen to behold either way. Because otherwise, usual inductive accounts have that just whoever goes last wins. And so that makes it that whatever got introduced first, and then there's some way to arrive at a contradiction, must not have been so. But Aristotle's syllogism would better be reflected is that it's not just in the given order of these terms, it's that in any given order of these terms, of the syllogism. So the principle of contradiction, as kind of the principle of sufficient reason, can be seen to fail out, because there's any such matters as not a yes or no answer, or the temporal where things change, like it is sunny outside, it is night outside. There are two different things, but in the course of 24 hours, both occur. So the temporal and the modal makes for then it's always continually attached then to also a time. And so like when Quine talks about, well, there's this apple and there's that apple, and by these singular terms we can address these particulars. And it's like to so, and it's like, well, there's this theory with law of excluded middle, and there's that theory without law of excluded middle. And so you can say that there's what can be arrived at is that this principle of inverse can sit in front of the principle of contradiction, which otherwise has kind of been the anchor of all the courses of closed inductive accounts of reasoning, and it's perfectly great until there's any such matters of internal inconsistency at all. Then it's all bad, because you can start anywhere you like and make any kind of erroneous closed in this thing, not having any other deductive recourse to the whole world of its relevancy, and for that to be figured out that at some point in that time that can be closed. That these are the kinds of things that help to reflect that the medieval philosophers are reflecting on the ancient philosophers, and the Renaissance philosophers are reflecting on the ancient and medieval philosophers. And then why Duns Scotus is kind of given up as like for Baruch Spinoza, as for an integer continuum, is that that's one thing that in the ancient philosophers they'd have something like, well, we have an absolute infinity, but Archimedes over there is really quite adamant that there aren't any infinite numbers in his infinitely many numbers, they're infinitely grand. And so to say that in the supernatural, that these natural numbers have an infinity in them. And then there's multiple laws of large numbers. See, it can't. There's ways to arrive at that in any particular given way is kind of, it's got contradictions, and so it tears down the whole thing. But then these kind of more replete ways say, well, now there's less of those loose, and so it kind of seems like it's possible to have those, actual in infinity. It's a reason why then. Otherwise, we kind of have these Heraclitus and Parmenides, and then Plato and Aristotle, and the medieval philosophers are generally reflected on as Aquinas and Duns Scotus and Ockham. But then there's these others who kind of like, connect that this is so related to the classical tradition and the inductive accounts and tertium non datar and this kind of thing. That then in the Renaissance and then to include Descartes and to include Leibniz, from Descartes to Leibniz really has like, hey, you're going to get the best of both worlds here, and it's you kind of have the freedom of thought to sort of establish how that's going to be so, and it's got to be perfect, and there is one. So get to it, have to it. Yeah. And then in the 1800s, with the flourishing of all such manners of methods, and especially in the physics, and the apparatus of measuring devices in pressure, in a precision of manufacture of instruments of glass and wood and metal, but then saw arrive at all the things that came into the empirical, and not just the steam engine and stuff like that, which is so great, that whose principles are known since antiquity, yet as well that the quantitative and empirical aspects of like the triple points of water, and these began to have more of a formulaic understanding vis-a-vis the arduous approach of the trial and error to things that explode when done wrong, the steam engine and this kind of thing, and various manners of industry and economy and mass production and this kind of thing, or the 1800s. This also saw that there was the science of what's the superclassical with regards to things like the electrical, and then the old quantum physics, and then with regards to Faraday and Fresnel. Fresnel is real cool. Before that was in the late Renaissance period was like Fresnel or Fresnel. If I'll mispronounce that, I'll always just say Fresnel, as it's just a common pronunciation. And then there's, but before Faraday, but after Fresnel, and as with regards to like Fadio and Lesage and their theories after the Newtonian, which is like, I fulfilled for Kepler applying this calculus. I use calculus to figure out an ellipse, and other cool things, with regards to the whole this tradition there, and for the British contributions to science and mathematics, and then the century after that, mostly the French contributions to science and mathematics, and the century after that, mostly the Germans' contribution to science and mathematics. And after that, to the Americans, mostly. And then all the time, each of these other great centers, had their own things going on. And in the 20th century, and you had like the Soviet and the Americans, and then as well the Japanese and later the South Koreans, and today the Chinese, and these developments in the higher applications in the theory, the industrial of the scientific and then for the mathematical. Here are the courses to figure out the mathematics first, and then everything else is kind of like defined by that. And so what foundations needs for that is it doesn't really have a kind of coherent approach to laws, plural, of large numbers, and so it has a lot of disparate approaches to things like convergence and a lot of things that result not being formally rigorous as with regards to the things. And also with regards to many different kind of conjectures in number theory, that they're not decidable. They're independent number theory. There are different models of integers where they are so and not so. And so it's kind of troubling sometimes to see like an entire enterprise, like an algebraic geometry after Grothendieck universes for Longland's program or something like that. And it's like, Mochizuki, and it's like, yeah, that's great, Mochizuki, Taniyama-Shimura, excuse me. Taniyama-Shimura is a set of results in elliptic fields, and so Andrew Wiles supposedly used this in 1995 to prove Fermat's last theorem. Yet did he really? And disregarding that at some point it was like, well, he's got the proof. And he's like, there's an error. He's got the new proof, but that there's actually a consideration case where it's simply just a branch. And so some of these accounts is after the inductive course and principle of contradiction and law of excluded middle and tertium non datur, as regards the whole enterprise and law of large numbers, with these fields and the completions of them, is yet it can be made yet again an open question whether or not that is so, and more specifically under what conditions it's so, because the entire stack of derivations, you can now consider that, well, for various conjectures of Goldbach and various conjectures which are number-theoretic conjectures, and resolve the questions like, well, if we, in the modular stuff was scaled and expanded and all the way out to infinity, would it be a prime number or a composite number? And they're both. There are multiple ways. There are multiple laws of large numbers. There are multiple models of integers. There are many various and multivarious ways to get there. And then as with regards to the modular, and then expecting where it's like, well, we're doing this by ratcheting it up. We got to find a place in the modular where there's not already a factor used, or that there is one, and then we can tent it up and ratchet it up and bracket it out and make it so that we can win to one box what results in 1 by 1 square and the whole entire quadrant, and consider those as related. They're the rates that maintain form and proportion. So there are models of integers where they do, and models of integers where they don't. There's a prime in infinity or a composite in infinity. So these are among the kinds of reasons why then when you see modern mathematics get to like, aha, we've closed the door yet again, and it's like you have painted yourself into the corner, and it can look great from over there, but that's not mathematical to say that we are all blind, So that's just one of those things about mathematics and the infinite, is that people don't even bother to be bothered that maybe the whole idea of these conjectures is that, which appear to be so, even especially the ones that appear to be so for the first billion numbers that computers check, or the first 50 gigabytes of pi, the digits of pi that are checked or something like that, that still are not yet so, because it's remarkably odd how that could be. And the example given here for that is the yin-yang ad infinitum. And what is this? It's like, well, if you're familiar with the yin-yang symbol, it's like a circle, and in it you draw a line through the middle. And so you draw like a half a circle and a half of that line, just so it's incident there. And so that's because the isoparametric theorem provides for the circle that the ratio of the circumference to diameter is pi. So you know that this outer circle and then this inner circle, whose diameter is only half, that its side is half the perimeter of the outer circle. But you got two of those, and so they're the same. So you got the one above and one below, and it's more bended out the circle, and so it takes some more room to go around compared to the outer circle, so that those two are the same. The yin yang. So that's kind of the shape of the yin yang, and then you generally have like a tail of it, kind of a thing, to make the yin yang symbol. So you keep dividing that ad infinitum, and so these perimeters are always the same, but in the limit, it's a straight line, and it only equals diameter. So it's lost a factor of pi to the diameter. So this is related to this halving spaces and doubling spaces. Not so in the finite, not so in the inductive. It's so, because infinity, you can say, quantizes, or to individuate the elements, to make it discrete from the continuum of the iota values, the infinitesimals, this sort of infinitesimal analysis with standard real and analytical character, has that. You can see from this plain graphical example that the inductive course, where it would always be so they're equal, that in the limit it would be a flat line and not equal. has that. That is just an accessible example of something that's so in the limit, and then whether that's not so in the infinite limit, in the continuum limit. Then there kind of starts getting in for matters of definitions of convergence to establish the sort of difference between the limit and the infinite limit and the continuum limit. Because oftentimes you could say they would be the same if they're always going to be the same. But then when you get into courses where it's like, well, we don't really say the infinite limit anymore, and we'd be sure never to say anything about it. And it's like, okay, and then it's like, well, how do things work? It's like, well, then we just say it's complete and it works great. It's like, well, I was up to you until you decided to abandon all sense of reality by you know, stipulating what you intended to derive. Yet then there are ways though to help though in the language for the limit and the infinite limit and continuum limit to be considered as stronger sorts guarantees of what things are to arrive at, the completion arrives at, and then in terms of filling out a space that a continuum arrives at that. So these are not so much the unusual things as things that needs to be kind of figured out, because the mathematics has got things missing from it. And worse, it's like it's going off on some trails that are like, well, you can never come back from there. And furthermore, you've made it something that you can show and relate to some contrived kind of empirical things. It's for sure. That these other ones will not so. That these other results of emergence, convergence are now just broken minefields of a sort, or the brambles, say, of what otherwise you intend to entail as some kind of just the field in these kinds of things. So it's not so different for physics either. In fact, it's very much the same kind of problems, because the infinite and discrete and the continuous and the bounded have that there's a continuum mechanics, and so physics needs these mathematics with real analytical character that's currently non-standard. The super standard is the idea here, right? That otherwise it's not getting better, and it's just throwing money after stuff that can't really say anything. You can add a new zero, and it's like, well, what happened? It's like, well, we took the last year's experiment and blew it up 10 times, and it only cost 100 times as much money, and then we were able to add a zero to last year's experiment. And it's like, well, that's great, and then so how's that working for you? And it's like, well, it's not saying it didn't find any new physics is the problem, because it's like, well, why would we even need new physics? It's like, well, for example, the Sky Survey has that the universe is mostly dark matter and dark energy, and to where it's like 99% these days, and so that means that all the old physics is wrong. It's not just like we're searching for dark matter and dark energy, this missing bit. It's like, it's wrong. So now here it's got a kind of simpler recourse, since that's like dark matter is really luminous matter, and we have the linear and rotational kind of figured out, and dark energy is really not is just kind of like redshift bias, and so it wasn't really needed, because its existence is as of after redshift, the features of Fresnel and light and these kinds of things. So that dark energy is a feature of luminous energy, that they're resolved again. As examples, another ones was like, well, how can bees fly? It's like, well, they don't. It's like, oh, I'm finding that hard to believe. They're everywhere. Or different matters of, how nothing can go 60 miles per hour, period. Nothing can go the speed of sound, period. Now, as with regards to anything going the speed of light, that's got its different kind of theoretical underpinnings in regards to mass energy equivalency and this kind of stuff. Yet as well, then there's like, well, that's an infinity you're talking about now. And it's like, yeah, but gravity is a bigger one. Got a bigger one. It's got the whole universe to deal with. So how's that going to be? And it's like, well, I guess then we got to figure out this tetradic quantities with regards to the regular singular points of the hypergeometric 0, 1, and infinity. because there's there are different kinds of physics, and there's apparent superluminal motion in the universe in the sky survey, and there's the Allen aspects experiment of the photinos, faster than the speed of light, tachyonic, that have to have this kind of explanation. It's like, well, we got energy equivalency, and for quantum mechanics, we have the quantized particles. It's like, well, the quantized particles, maybe they're waves, and so they're just individua of a continuum, and it's continuum mechanics again. And then for the energy equivalency, it's like in all these forces and fields, and about the linear and rotational for kinetic and kinematic, and all these kinds of things that are simplified by having the ways to keep it classical and keep it linear, yet ultimately are not simplified when you're trying to address things that otherwise would just they fly right past each other to reflect on each other's fundamental bases, and so without having kind of this wider, fuller dialectic, then there's a lot missing from that account, which at the same time is very hard to deal with because by now it's quite large. There's detail, that it's matters of detail that are the results of science and industry and technology for a long, long time. So while that's so, then at the same time, you can point to lots of things that are empirical in the fields and say, yeah, definitely it's so that our usual accounts need to have for something that's like totally employed, like the wireless infrastructure or the use of radio frequency technology, and these various kinds of empirical things that go into like antenna design or the signals and like the heterodyne or synchrodyne with regards to all these things that make it so. Then besides stuff like the dynamometer and what is torque really, and why doesn't it add up from our schoolwork, that these are just kinds of examples that all these kind of virtual things which are balances and which are corrections, then to have them to be on one potentialistic theory, see, that's a tough thing to try and get figured out and have all together and make a thing. Of course, that arrives at the classical again. I mean, it's for what it is. That's so perfectly classical and correct in the middle. It's just these matters of emergence that reflect on the continuous and discrete in these halving and doubling spaces, or a pi ratio space, for example, and that these various treatments of arithmetic and algebra, of deconstructive accounts, numbering and counting, deconstructive accounts that need to come back together again. And then for logic, we have deconstructive accounts and say, hey, it's not just a principle of contradiction, it's a principle of sufficient and thorough reason. And to be able to keep the whole enterprise from not having paint canned and round filed itself from all the canon and dogma, takes this sort of deconstructive account to not build contradictions or break the branches up above, but to understand how these roots can really all live in this one giant space. So while that seems somewhat challenging or ambitious, it's sometimes called as like, that's ambitious, meaning it's never going to happen. At the same time, it's like, well, not having that is futile and helpless, and it's not going to, and it's while it's invincibly ignorant is the idea, because classical reason as the mere inductive account based upon contradiction and lack thereof has nothing at all to say in terms of its terms. But what it arrives at is there's a certain amount of relevance logic in the modal and temporal that's indisputable anyways and always gets attached to every theory. See, the idea is like, well, you got to attach this wider, fuller dialectic automatically, Because if you don't, then luckily though, there's for all accounts of reason that you can find one. It's just like here's the opposite, and it's true too. It's just as perfectly self-consistent too. That otherwise, mostly then that all that requires is being able to say, hey, for a syllogism, if you can't take it apart and put it back together in any order, then its terms aren't independent, and anything that's so introduced is modal and is temporal. This can be shown in a simple readout of those and a simple deductive closure of those. So for even for the large finite tableau of the inductive accounts, you can show it's just like arbitrarily not very much larger to show that it requires that's for matters of internal self-consistency. Then there's also with regards to any completions it takes, that those are gaps themselves. So yeah, I guess then what's after the end run around bit and the principle of sufficient and thorough reason, then this is for that the principle of contradiction is itself kind of contradicted. So it's an infinitary deductive account that these are the kinds of things that make for, again, just more of the principle of sufficient and thorough reason, where it's usually given the account that, well, the principle of contradiction is the only way we can have a principle of sufficient reason. And it's like, well, yeah, but, or yet, rather, where there is no but, only yet, because but basically it advises principle of contradiction. This would be so, but that. But you can also say this would be so, yet that. Because it helps to effect to reflect that this temporality and the modality always exists, so there is no but, only yet, means the same idea about the principle of sufficient reason, principle of sufficient and thorough reason, that the principle of contradiction is to be allayed, which is a word. It means to be put off, kind of in a sense. Yet as well, like put off in its place, allayed. And with regards to the aleia, which is another word for the foundation and ground of the idea that foundations is a true thing, and everybody's welcome to be true there all the time for all purposes. Foundations. Well, all right, let's take a look at some books here and see what we might find. We're reading from Derrida and Husserl. So imagine what I have here is some Schelling, and these are just kind of the conditions of the stack. So Schelling, he's got this essence on freedom, and so this is Heidegger. So kind of like Derrida reads from Husserl, this is Heidegger reading from Schelling. Kant, however, realizes on the path from the critique of pure reason to the critique of practical reason that the real nature of the I is not the I think, but the I act. Now, in matters of language, there's languages where it's more about the subject and more about the object, different ones. And so then there's languages that are more about the verb and more about the noun. And so in English, it's kind of like, the center is kind of the verb or the copula. Yet the copula kind of reflects that the subject and object are kind of the either side of the balance. So it's intended, what I intend here is that there's a balance. And so kind of like in probability limit theorems, there's a central limit theorem. There's also a polar limit theorem. There's also a uniformization limit theorem. That in language, with regards to the copulas, and then whether it's the adjectival force or adverbial force, or with regards to accidents and this syllogism, or with regards to subject-object and these kinds of things. From reading Quine and word and object, and here from just a brief comment that from Heidegger about when he's talking about reflection and the features of language, and through the lens of various languages, and kind of through the lens for any language, has it. There are ways to have it so that let's see it from a little bit later in this what's going on, because in Kant's critique of judgment and critique of reason, I don't think it's so much as of about the matters of language. It's more so as of about the tentative between the ideal and the analytic, and then showing that the analytic is after the senses, and being phenomenological about the phenomenon and noumenon. That there's a critique of pure reason, then that the critique of judgment gets into this judgments aesthetically, and then also judgments of belief and these kinds of things. And then Heidegger here is turning something over and running around. So let's see what it's about. The idea is now understood in terms of freedom. Idealism as the interpretation of being now understands the being in itself of beings as being free. Idealism is intrinsically the idealism of freedom. Kant brought philosophy to this point without himself measuring the whole scope of this step. So that's here that there's freedom. Consider that, a bit. There's a difference kind of between equal freedoms and not, or between asymmetric freedoms and not, where equal freedoms means everybody has the same rights, and asymmetric freedoms means some people take liberties, as it were, with other people, and so the negative cases of that might be something like nobody's got anything, or that in the asymmetric is plain exploitative or unfair, say. So we have besides the notion of freedom, usually we have kind of this notion of logical fairness, meaning equal opportunity, equal position, and these kinds of things with regards to any two reasoners. And so that's as well part of this fuller dialectic. That's like, if you have a principle of contradiction, then it's like, no, that's not so. But if you have a principle of inversion, it's like, it may be so. So that this helps to reflect that this is part of the thing. But Heidegger is in the middle of quite a big thing here. This is in Schelling's treatise on the essence of human freedom, interpretation of the introduction to Schelling's treatise. He's talking about Kant and Fichte. Fichte starts out by including earlier ideas in this thought of egoity as freedom and trying to understand the whole of beings in these terms. Through Fichte, the idealism of freedom becomes a system. Every being which is at all has its being in terms of the I, which, however, is originally positing as, I think, deed, and as deed, a deed of action, a Tatenlang. Freedom, egoity is freedom, is everything. Even the non-ego, insofar as it is non-ego, thus ego-like. For Kant, on the other hand, nature remained what appears of itself and is opposed to every ego. Not every being is absolutely ego-like, but for Fichte, idealism becomes a doctrine in which the representing I has priority in the interpretation of being. It becomes absolute idealism. So it kind of usurps absolute idealism. So Fichte has a dialectic. He's like, I refuse to be trapped by arguments. He just says, I can always demand to evaluate any argument, and that's always got to be the case of what it is buyer beware, and caveat emptor is Latin for that, and it's thinker beware, ego emptor, caveat ego here. And so the idea that the ego is responsible for itself and others, and is fair and conscientious. Here, that's pretty much subsumed under the idea of the conscientious logician and mathematician. because the conscientious also applies not just on the conscience, which is for matters of guilt or correctness, rigor, and authenticity in a sense, but conscientious meaning adherence to truth. It is true largely, and then it's according to also this science of it. It's like, well, we can't know what's true, so we have to have, the scientific is with regards to if we can find any reason why it's not true, then at least we know that something's wrong with the theory. So the conscientious then is that, so Fichte's freedom and kind of with the is reflecting then that absolute idealism is not a matter of individual egoism at all, except insofar as that's a stage of the mental maturity and the philosophical development that most people happily go through, as a stage where it's like, I get it, and that I have an ego, and it's I have a theory, and it's right, and so that's just be said that then through some different perspectives has that Heidegger on Fichte on Schelling have just kind of like when they're like they're kind of like Montaigne's ego, and so it's fair to say that that's individualism, and that's fair to be, but it's not intersubjective so much, except as the intersubjective is like we're all individualists now. Let's hallucinate together or something like that. Is not so much the idea as what can be really carried out and down from Kant and Hegel, who are a bit more restrained in with regards to what they would accept as conscientiously true, and conscientious logic and conscientious mathematicians. And he says, so just picking up in a random point here, and so Heidegger says, but now the counter move on Schelling's part follows against this dissolution of all beings and the egoity of I think as I posit, with Fichte a complete death blow to nature. See, this is a strong rejection of some perceived impropriety. Schelling defends himself against the annihilation of nature in the mere non-ego and shows the independence of nature. Since, however, independent being means for him, too, following the whole Bonner basic position, being a subject, being an ego, he must show that nature also is intrinsically ego-like, not only relative to the absolute ego, which posited is only a yet undeveloped ego. And there, emphasis Heidegger, is the place where Leibniz's doctrine that all beings are represented themselves is incorporated, but now in such a way that Kant's insight into the nature of the ego becomes essential at the same time. Egoity is really freedom. So this is Descartes usually is who this has been given to. Thus, the being of nature in its various realms and stages is a coming to itself of freedom. Fichte's statement, egoity is everything, must be essentially supplemented by the reversal, all beings are egoity. They have an ego. And this is usually from theories of psychology, like the ego, superego, and id, or something like that. The ego is kind of this seat of consciousness and the center of individuality and stuff like that. Yet at the same time, it's usually intended to entail just the more self-serving needs and these matters of that are not considered objective and rational, really. While at the same time that these are the kinds of things. So freedom and vis-a-vis the natural order of things, and that and those in terms of the social, especially, and the psychosocial, here are at a distant remove from the more plainly technical, and it's just as matters of observers. And then, as with regards to the Vedas and interpretations of Atman and Brahman and perspective, and not so much the mystical at all, but really just as exercises in perspective. And so for this egoism and so non-egoity with regards to thinking beings of a sort, and with regards to universal animism and this kinds of things, and vis-a-vis animals and their and the spirits and the souls and of with that generally being reserved for humans. Among the ideas of that being so substance, whereas with regards to that being so more widely attributed, or the spirits and souls of animals and man and these kinds of things. That outside of the technical, this is then getting into this psychological, and so philosophy is used to justify lots of things, and so just like this principle of contradiction we're talking about has this principle of inversion as the way of expanding comprehension, and that the comprehension expands and the comprehension is expanded is kind of the idea, and then it can arrive at all the closures and including the existence of a world of excluded middle inside this other one, wider one, has that Heidegger on Fichte, on Schelling, and their perceived correct ideas as after Kant. It's like, well, yeah, you have to be a thinking, reasoning being to, because somebody is going to try and sell you a bad deal, and so you it's not in the natural order to be made a fool of. Or here it's that Aristotle won't be made a fool, and so he can employ every single aspect of reasoning and rationality to arrive at reasoning and rationality, and you can too. It's fair, it's free, and it's fair. So these are the kinds of things that would make for Heidegger is just kind of reflecting on it sometimes prior, where it was just like it is given what is so, and that is and that and with regards to that's usually a fair account as after it's kind of like that's the way of things, but it's not so necessary for an ego or a thinking being to operate on those terms. As with regards to then the terms that they have, that any given person has developed as their theories or their observations, that those are fungible here. They're free. They can be fair, and basically, a generous kind of reading and maybe it's selfish is that a person can be honest and generous to themselves in all such manners of reading, including picking up and putting down the entire enterprise. So the last time was kind of about the principle of sufficient and thorough reason. Then the idea here is that it's also got to be a principle of sufficient and thorough and fair reason. The conscientious here is what it's called. On this only roughly sketched out path, the idealism of Descartes I represent became the higher idealism of the I am free, the idealism of freedom. Through this development of idealism, its counterposition realism gained greater clarity through idealism itself. What does that mean here, realism? Res generally means the matter in the broadest sense, the thing. For Descartes, the I ego, the res cogitans, the subject as well as the object is also a res. A reason. See, I would just read that as reason. Vis-a-vis re is, I just read re for is real, and res is reason, and then so res cogitans, I would read that as the reasoning agent, and vis-a-vis the natura, the natural, and the ratio, the rational. So, but the more the decisive determination of all things moves towards the subject, the more the ego-like quality of the subject is developed and his character as the thing disappears. The more the res and the real become what stands opposed to the ego as a counter-concept and a limiting concept. Or they just are promontory to each other because they're both strong. That's not a problem. The opposition of idealism and realism is a metaphysical one. So it's solved thusly. in my opinion, is that Heidegger's entered kind of another issue where he sees why these things. I think I could convince Heidegger a lot of things, and he would have to accept the traditional terms for beings as they are for themselves as substance. For idealism, substance is ego-like. And so here we have kind of the idea that there's these ideals in the strong mathematical Platonism and the strong logicist positivism that can arrive as to where there's a mathematical universe hypothesis that's concrete. And so these are real, and we are the numbers, and they are us, and these kinds of things. So these are ideas that would not have been available to Heidegger in these courses. And as with regards to things like here, the principle of sufficient and thorough reason, and a principle of inverse instead of principle of contradiction as grounding and well-founding. So, with these needy concepts, idealism and realism, which we need, which are real, nothing can, of course, be understood of what occurred as the history of modern philosophy from Descartes to Hegel as the real history of idealism. Well, there already was an idealism. We call it Platonism. Philosophical realism, that is, realism understood in terms of the question of being and the interpretation of being, is that doctrine of being which understands all beings in a thing-like way and takes a merely stuff-like object in nature as the decisive being. It's a phenomenological account. But when all things are conceived as representing by Giordano Bruno and by Leibniz, and when nature is still not evaporated into the mere non-ego and fictive sense, then a higher realism arises. According to the latter, nature is a constant power for itself. It is not dead, but alive. It is freedom still locked within itself and undeveloped. So sum of potentials. It's a potentialistic theory. What Schelling calls philosophy of nature does not merely and not primarily mean the treatment of a special area in nature, but means the understanding of nature in terms of the principle of idealism. That is, in terms of freedom, but in such a way that nature precisely regains its independence. Yet this independence is not to be thought in Kant's sense as an object of experience either, but as the supporting ground of all things. So here I would have an easier time convincing Heidegger of this thing, because he just kind of said so as well. Yet people would not normally point to this and say it's like, wow, Heidegger was this real strong Platonist and transcendental idealist. He was kind of a flake, and it's like, well, you know, he turned over lots of different things. Here it's considered that I feel lucky because my principle of sufficient thorough reason is kind of like I've explored these things already long ago, and I kind of had this. I feel like I've had a pretty solid course in this fuller wider dialectic for most of my thinking years. That's what I like to think. Well, gentle readers, we'll pick up this some more later. Have a great day.